And now on the line is Neil Wilson, an education support worker from the Western Region Drug and Alcohol Task Force. Neil, welcome to the programme.
Thank you. Good afternoon.
Okay, Neil, I've done a lot of interviews in the last few years on the issues of legal and illegal drug abuse in Ireland. Before we talk more in depth in regards to these issues in your region, could you first of all tell us a bit about the history of your organisation and the kind of work that you do with them today?
Yeah, well, it was a good 12 years ago now. The government put a lot of money into local drugs task forces, mainly around Dublin, to really kind of centre on the issues affecting drug users in various locations. And basically it was kind of deemed a success, and they moved it out into the regions. So now each area of Ireland has its own drugs task force, and essentially we work behind the scenes to try and get all the services of government to do with the HSE and education and the Gardaí and customs and anyone else who has any kind of interest in anything to do with alcohol or drugs, be it from the voluntary service sector or NGOs or the government, essentially working together and supporting each other. That's really what we're trying to do.
And what counties are in your catchment area?
Well, the Western region is Roscommon, Mayo, Galway, and I've got the job in terms of supporting prevention work in County Galway.
Okay, we'll move on anyway. We can come back if you want to talk a bit more about your organisation in general. I presume that you're very happy, like I am, that the Public Health Alcohol Act got signed into law a couple of months ago, are you?
Well, mixed feelings. I'm glad for the measures that they did put in, but it took it must be the longest pregnancy of any bill that any government has ever managed to bring forward. It took an awful long time to bring it forward, and a lot of the measures were, to coin a phrase as we're talking about alcohol, were very much watered down. So it's a bit of a mixed bag, but at least it shows that it's on the public agenda, and it shows that people are talking about it and people are considering it, and that in itself is obviously a good thing.
Could you tell me, it's a big question, could you tell me how big or significant the alcohol and illegal drug abuse issues are in the counties you work in?
Well, normally we use the term misuse because, at the end of the day, people use and misuse drugs and alcohol, and people are going to have various sort of consequences from that. Most of the attention tends to be focused when we look in the media. A lot of it is focused on Dublin, and a lot of it is focused on heroin use. Our figures, by comparison, would be a lot lower in terms of heroin, and obviously there is heroin used in County Galway, Mayo, Roscommon. But overwhelmingly, our issues would mainly concern alcohol, and there would also be a lot of use of cannabis as well. Cannabis is often grown these days as an Irish product, out in grow houses, out in the country, and obviously it filters into the local market. It'd be fair to say, though, unlike perhaps, to be fair to say, 20 or 30 years ago, virtually any drug is pretty much readily available in any town or city in the country. So it really just comes down to what, in a sense, people's tastes are, in the sense of what, resonates with the local population in terms of what they prefer. And it seems to be, alcohol and cannabis, and then probably with the music festivals, things like ecstasy, probably crop up the most commonly.
Over the last few months, I interviewed Barry Dempsey from the Dún Laoghaire Drug and Alcohol Task Force, Dr. Bobby Smith and Tony Duffin from Anna Liffey. They were saying as well that alcohol and cannabis, like there's a huge problem with cannabis, isn't there? It's the biggest illegal drug, I think, is it?
Well, in terms of consumption, it's certainly the most used illegal drug in the country. As with all drugs, it just comes down to the effects it has on the particular person. And certainly you'll meet some cannabis users who claim that they've used it for years and they don't have any particular ill effects from it. Other people use it and might use it once or twice, and what they feel from it, they never want to use it again. So people's reactions do vary considerably, and I think that's important to sort of bear that in mind. It's the same with alcohol. Any amount of a use of any drug is going to be harmful in a sense, but it just depends on the particular situation, the context, and how much someone has. That's what's going to make a real effect on the consequences in terms of what's happening to them.
I've been told that the cannabis smoking nowadays in Ireland compared to 20 years ago. 20 years ago, people who smoke cannabis generally smoke hash, whereas nowadays it's grass and it's highly potent. Is that the case in your region as well?
Well, it just comes down to the percentage of the active ingredient in it, which is THC. I'm not going to bore you with the long chemical name. But when we're talking 20 years ago, most cannabis was probably around about the 4-5% THC. And now we're talking on average sort of 14-15, and some forms are stronger still. So you're looking at something which is essentially at least 3 or 4 times the strength it was 20 years ago. Whether that's a significant problem, that's what the scientists argue over. But it's certainly true that the strength of it has increased over the years.
And I've been told as well that it's getting mixed with other things, like to increase the potency of it as well. I don't know how often that happens, but that happens a lot as well, does it?
Well, it's difficult to say, but, it's true that with all drugs, there's always a temptation from the drug dealer's point of view to mix in other substances which either bulk it out and therefore there's more profit, or to add a different substance that has a similar kind of effect to it, to the drug that's being sold, and that way again you make more money. So that temptation is always very, very clearly there. When we just look at normal foods, if you think of something like a ham sandwich, the amount of regulations for the farmer, the abattoir, the shop, everything else, it's an enormous amount of regulations, and you still end up sometimes with, horse instead of ham, perhaps. And that's in, the legal sector. When it comes to drugs, there's obviously none of that regulation at all. And the temptations are always so great to increase profits that, stuff is going to get added, full stop.
And the profits for the drug dealers are still huge, aren't they, compared to the past? Are they?
Well, it depends. It depends who you're talking to in terms of the chain. At the bottom end, in terms of a person who might be a young person and they get a bit of cannabis for themselves, bought off a dealer, sort of the next level up. And if they sell on, they keep a bit for themselves. They're not really making very much money. As with all things in life, it seems it's the people at the top of the tree that tend to rake in the real profits.
And is there a huge problem with people getting drugs, not just cannabis, other illegal drugs as well, on tick or on credit and getting into trouble with drug dealers? I've heard that's a huge problem in Dublin anyway. Yeah.
And it's certainly we see that it's a temptation, and certainly I work with the local Gardaí here, and they often talk about when they do raid places, they find any number of things like iPhones and iPads, even bikes, even cars sometimes, that are held until payment comes forth. And then very often when payment does turn up, they then look for some more. And that's really, a very, very severe problem. It can be, and it can even work down to quite a low level, to quite a small amount of money. And it's good that across the country there is the drug intimidation scheme, which sounds rather odd, but perhaps not the right phrase for it. But essentially, you can contact a superintendent in a local Gardaí area, and they will deal with it directly, offering advice and actually looking at the information so they can use that in their activities to try and tackle the drug dealers in an area. So it is recognised, and there is specific support out there that's put in place to support people who can be in those kind of situations. It's not uncommon, perhaps, for a young person to end up in a drug debt. Maybe it says not a particularly large amount, but then the drug dealer comes knocking on the door to the parents. They'll have no shame in doing that, and of course, if they don't pay, they're upping the money. And then it's, they end up selling the second car, getting a credit union loan out, whatever it might be. And, then they're seen as an easy touch. It's probably only at that stage when the money's all gone that they might think of actually contacting the Gardaí and trying to do something about it.
Okay, and if these people are seen as a soft touch to parents for giving money to the drug dealers, could the situation progress from there even though they've already paid the money back?
Yeah, I mean, that's it. At the end of the day, you're dealing with people in, criminal gangs. So if they can see a way of making money that's easy to them, they're probably going to take it. At the end of the day, the primary motivation for any crime gang is to make as much money as possible. And, they're going to do it in a way that it means they're going to make the most and less likely to get caught. So if they see a route there, if it's through using drug debt to their own advantage, the chances are they might take it.
Okay, and I find that remarkable because I would have thought, like, say if parents have a teenager and he has a drug debt for €100 or whatever, and the drug dealer is called to the house and the parents give the drug dealers the money, I would have thought that would be the end of it. No?
Well, you would hope, and it depends on the individuals involved. But I'm just saying, certainly that we do hear back situations where it's not left alone. And it's difficult to ever know the full story. But it's just at the end of the day, if people choose to use a drug like cannabis, which many people would regard as relatively harmless, and we could argue all day about that, but either way you're looking at it, by default, you're obviously buying from someone who is in a criminal group or family or gang of some sort, and therefore you're obviously involving yourself with those kind of characters, and it's never easy or straightforward. It's not like purchasing something from a reputable store.
There used to be a phone number about 10 years ago called Dáil to stop drug dealing. I don't know if is it still on the go, is it? Do you know?
It's not something I've seen promoted recently, but I honestly couldn't answer that one, to be perfectly honest with you. It probably is still it's probably still about, but certainly in terms of information towards Gardaí, that is funneled through whichever route it is, through one of those sort of numbers. They're always grateful for that information, because at the end of the day, there's only so much resources drug squads have, and they're always grateful for information from the general public. Even if it leads to nothing, it's better to be aware and to check things out.
Are the guards doing a good job, do you think, in your region?
It's like anywhere, any government service you talk to, they do the best they can with the resources they've got available. And, we are talking a situation where drugs are very readily available, and a lot of these gangs are working in what some would regard as a very professional way, as I say, to make as much money as possible. So even if they stop one particular source, it means that another one is then more likely to open up, or people, switch between the particular drugs that they use. So it's always a constant fight. And, that's always ongoing. At the end of the day, the amount of drugs that are taken by Gardaí is essentially based on how much we're prepared to pay for Gardaí services in this country.
How does the levels of alcohol and illegal drug abuse compare across the 3 counties you work in? Go on, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, we would have figures that are pretty similar across the national picture. I mean, they do move kind of up or down slightly, but you don't really get any massive variation among the most used drugs across the country. I mean, just to sort of quote you kind of off the top of the head figures of how we kind of work things, we recognise that by the end of post-primary school, just over about 9 out of 10 young people are going to have tried alcohol. About half of them will have tried tobacco, and about a third of them will have tried an illegal drug, and overwhelmingly that's going to be cannabis. We could argue all day long about what the actual figures are, but what we have to just, take on board in terms of what we're working with, it's people who do use an illegal drug are certainly not unusual. They're certainly not the majority, but it is used by many hundreds of thousands of people every month.
The population of County Galway is much bigger than Mayo and Roscommon, I believe. So are most of the people who misuse alcohol and illegal drugs in County Galway in your region?
It about balances out. Roscommon and Mayo adds up to roughly Galway, so they're fairly similar figures.
My parents have a house outside Castlerea in Roscommon, So like, I'd be interested on a personal level to find out, like, there is a significant illegal drug problem in Roscommon as well, is there?
I couldn't speak for that area in particular, but certainly we're having the prison in the area as well, and therefore the influx of people in and out connected to the prison. That's certainly been on an anecdotal basis. I don't have any evidence to back that up, but on an anecdotal basis, people certainly talk about that and that affecting the local drug market.
All right. Do you, in your alcohol and drug task force, have enough funding to be able to do all the work you would like to do?
Well, yeah, there's a very obvious answer to that. You know, when it came back with the funding cuts over the years, that there has been a reduction, and we work with what we can. But in terms of the services available that we would like to provide, yeah, you know, it's rather like in the response I gave talking about Gardaí. At the end of the day, in terms of healthcare and in terms of education and in terms of any other support services, we can have as much as we're prepared to pay for, you know, and that's the bottom line. And we have seen cuts over the years. We don't do as much as perhaps we would like to or have done in the past, but we do our best with what we've got and move forward from there.
The debate about alcohol and illegal drug abuse in Ireland seems to me to be in the process of evolving a lot. Would you concur with this?
Well, in the sense that right around the world, different jurisdictions have been looking at this in terms of, more particularly around cannabis more than anything else, to look at what they consider to be the best way to deal with it is. And certainly many of the states in America have not exactly legalized cannabis, but at least decriminalized it. And to be honest, places like Colorado, where they've really opened up the market there, most of the researchers in terms of the drug world, they're in there now, kind of looking in real close depth at how it's affected that particular state. And I think it's when we get the findings from kind of seeing what's happening elsewhere, it will inform the debate in Ireland much more. Obviously, we've had decriminalisation in Portugal, and a lot of people point to that as well. So when different jurisdictions or different countries are looking at changing the laws around alcohol, and more particularly around what are commonly called soft drugs, more the sort of cannabis, ecstasy, that sort of area, then yes, it's going to be of interest, and it's something that is going to evolve. And that's always been the case. We're always changing things as new substances come along. It was only 8-9 years ago that we had the phenomenon of the head shops, for example. And then we kind of looked at that, and politicians made their choices about how to deal with it.
I know you gave a talk in Roscommon town, I think it was yesterday, and you gave one. The talk you gave yesterday was about ecstasy, and the one last month in Roscommon town was about cocaine. You do a kind of do this kind of every year, do talks in different areas about education, yeah?
Yeah, well, the Drugs Task Force puts on a whole range of different trainings, ranging from looking at the sort of information around drugs and how the markets are developing. We'd have a lot of interest in what we call NPS, new psychoactive substances, which used to be what people called the head shop products. Very often these days they're bought online, or that certainly is of interest. But then also we do training which is actually around helping people in terms of the counselling skills and support services, and you know they've proved to be very popular as well. So it's a big part of what we do, and there's many people out there who are youth workers, social workers, involved in the education area, who want to improve their knowledge. But it's also to take that time to discuss how it's going with various of their clients and people they work with, and to learn off each other. And I think that's a very important part of it as well.
Considering you gave a talk yesterday on ecstasy in Roscommon and one on cocaine last month, do you want to just say anything about those two drugs, ecstasy and cocaine?
Well, when it comes down to it, you know, we never put a message out there to say you should or shouldn't use. When it comes to someone choosing to use a drug, really they just need good quality information so they can make choices for themselves. Because if we just put it out there and say, you know, you shouldn't use that because, that's not going to kind of work by itself. You know, people have to take into consider what the law says, and they may or may not agree with it. They have to take into account the short-term effects on their body. and they have to take into account the long-term effects. They've also got to take into account, as we were talking earlier, about where they source any such drug from, and being therefore involved with essentially buying it from criminals, of course, and also got to think about their effect on their families and relationships and everybody else. And it's only in that context that people can actually kind of figure out for themselves what they feel comfortable with. And as we always say, the best way of reducing harm is not to use something. But if you are going to choose to drink or to use a drug, you want to do it in a way that's as safe as possible.
I know you're an education support worker with the task force, so you're coming at it from an education point of view, yeah?
Yeah.
No, because when I interviewed Barry Dempsey from the Dún Laoghaire Task Force a couple of months ago, and Dr. Bobby Smith, they were coming at it from a kind of a client-centered point of view as regards counselling and that kind of stuff, you know what I mean? So you aren't coming from that perspective. Because they were saying to me that like cannabis and all illegal drugs, I think cannabis, cocaine, ecstasy, they're just so fiercely damaging to people's mental health, you know what I mean? It's kind of tragic,
Yeah, I mean, it's like all these things. It depends on how much we use of something. It depends what it's mixed with. It depends the context in which we're using it. And, to be fair to people like you're mentioning there, they often meet perhaps the more extreme examples because they've ended up with them as clients or as patients. But it would also be fair to say, if we take something like alcohol, the vast majority of people in this country drink, and if you want to avoid any harm from alcohol, well, don't drink. But if you choose to drink, and I drink myself, then it's about thinking about how much the quantity is. It's thinking about this kind of situations you can get in, and trying to avoid the worst outcomes from it, and making those decisions as reasonably as we can. Because at the end of the day, we all have motivations to use substances which kind of make us feel sharper, or to calm us down, or to maybe see the world a bit differently. And we're making those choices all the time. Very often they're legal choices. They could be around sort of, drinking energy drinks or caffeine. It could be around using alcohol. It could just be around anything that changes our mood and how we feel. And that might be gambling, sex, food, anything you want to mention. So if we're making those choices as human beings, we've got to be fair to people and honest with people and say, look, if you do use alcohol or another drug, there's a certain amount of risk involved. And these are the things which are likely to increase your risk, and you might end up with medical problems or otherwise. And these are the kind of things which will reduce your risks. And I think that's a very honest and genuine way of dealing with people. Because if we're just completely black and white, then people aren't going to listen at all, to put it bluntly.